30-year police officer, and he's trying to get the word out so that less people feel alone and to help minimize some of the pressures from this, because it is it's an easy trap that many people fall into. I see more and more young people falling into it too. It's an easy escape. I don't want to minimize alcoholism, but I went the whole regular show without talking about Jimmy Buffett or Whitesboro, New Jersey. So in the after show, I'm going to have a little... we were randomly put together. Somebody said, hey, you might like this guy. You might... And I said, okay. And we went back and forth on text messages. We were supposed to do the show, and he was busy, I was busy, and went back and forth. So we finally ended up, the stars aligned today, and I saw his truck, and I saw this, the word, he had a little poem thing on the dash, had the word volcano on it. So I thought, oh, maybe a Jimmy Buffett fan. I said, don't do that thing where you think somebody's into what you're into because you see a word. So then I walked through, I noticed his front license plate was bent a little on the end. As I walked around, I looked at it and said, Parrot Head. I was like, aha. And then he says, look at the back plate. I look at the back plate, it's Jimmy Buffett. So we got to talking about Jimmy Buffett, and who, for better or for worse, ties in a little bit to drinking, because at the concerts, there is a bit of drinking going on at the concerts.
A ton of it.
And I saw people that drinking enhanced their concert experience. I saw drinking that it detracted from it. And I saw drinking where I didn't understand why you would pay that much money for a ticket to go sleep somewhere.
Correct.
Sleep on Jimmy Buffett's lawn. And there was a lot of that. And we talked about Jimmy Buffett, and I asked him his favorite song, and he passed by not saying Margaritaville, because that's the way you fail the favorite Jimmy Buffett song test. And talked about that. Then somehow we got on towns, and I love telling people when they say, well, where are you from? I love saying Whitesboro, New Jersey. And they say, well, what's that near? And I say, well, it's between Burley and Irma. And that doesn't help anybody. He knew exactly where I was talking about. It's the first person in my life that didn't work on, because he was from right next to it at Wildwood Crest in Rio Grande, Rio Grande's on the other side of Irma, right?
It's in between.
In between
Whitesboro and Irma.
Yeah. Yeah. And this whole area we're talking about is not that big.
No.
It's not that big. And then we knew somebody who I haven't thought about in years, and it just took me back to a whole other time when life was so much simpler down there. And we were talking about when we were growing up down there, you fished, and you look for bait.
That's correct.
That's what you did.
Yeah.
There was no internet.
No.
There was 3 channels on the TV.
Came home when the street lights came on.
Yeah. I remember where there wasn't street lights, there was street lights down there for a while in some parts, but you didn't. It was a much simpler time, and I don't know that we also talked about the proliferation of news and bad news and how you can't escape anymore. I don't know that the world was a perfect place when we were growing up, but we sure weren't reminded of the horrors repeatedly throughout the day. There were horrors that just skipped us by, and you're not supposed to know everything. Our little brains can't handle it.
Well, you didn't have, as we talked about, you didn't have the platform of social media like you do now, where it's on every news channel, it's on every feed, every Instagram, Facebook, you name it, it's there.
It's an amplifier.
And it is an amplifier. I mean, everybody has access to it.
And everybody thinks that they're an expert. Everybody thinks that they have an opinion. I see people all the time on there that want to retweet the news and the weather to me. Like, they're my source for the news and the weather, I don't know exactly what the use of it is. It's somewhere between pictures of your food, pictures of your cat, and retweeting news or arguing about nothing. But there's got to be a more productive way. And I think back of how the internet and social media is the exact opposite of everything I had growing up in Whitesboro.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing. I mean, it was almost. It was so long ago. It was a big deal to call somebody. You usually walked over to their house, you know, and there was. It wasn't like the house was next door. You'd walk a couple miles to go see if somebody was home.
That's true.
You know.
Yeah. Well, growing up in the Crest, it was a lot closer. The houses were a lot closer. But then, like I said, about 5th grade, we moved offshore to Rio Grande, and it was certainly a walk through the woods to your buddy's house.
Yeah.
You know, in our immediate neighborhood, not too far. But then if you walk to the other neighborhood, well, you're walking through the woods and you're going over to your buddy's house, or you'd give him a call from your home. But you certainly didn't have cell phones. And, you know, I remember nights playing wiffle ball in the front of my house till almost 11 o'clock at night with a sand chair as the strike zone.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's how we grew up. And it was like you talked about, it was a much easier time. You know, the worst thing I heard about as a kid growing up was the Vietnam War. And that was, you know, I was born in 1965. So that was kind of coming to an end, you know, a few years after that. And I had an uncle who was there. And again, it was something that, you know, we didn't talk about because it was hardcore. You know what I mean? There was a lot of bad stuff happening. And, you know, and it goes into the addiction thing again, where, you know, if you're going to get better, you got to talk about it. You can't bury it, you know, because you'll keep pressing that stuff down. And sooner or later, it's going to come out, whether it comes out in, you know, eating or drinking or whatever it is, it's going to come out.
Well, I remember going through the woods there, and, you know, you had that Huck Finn-like existence. But I remember you'd see little fire rings, and you'd see where some kids had brought beer and wine out there, and that was probably the beginning of some problems probably started back there.
That was my beginning. That's exactly where it started, no doubt about it. When I was, you know, a young kid coming out of, you know, not so much grade school, but high school for sure. Like, that was the thing, you know, you have a little party back in the woods on a weekend after a football game or whatever. And it was always, but that's the difference. You know what I mean? Like, I was that guy who was always getting sick. That should have been the first thing that came to my mind that said, you're not like these other kids. You're different. And I guess all along I felt different, but that not being part of it, that was like, oh, I was being like everybody else. I was drinking like everybody else, but I was always the guy who was getting sick. And that should have been my first indicator. Like, hey, you can't drink, man. This is not something you can do.
But back then there was no mechanism to do anything with somebody, even if they wanted help for that.
Well, there were, but it was very
medieval.
It was very low key. Again, there wasn't, you know, the place my dad went to, as I said, was, you know, at the time, $800. I think they took a collection up at the bar, the local bar, because the owner was a really good friend of my dad's. And they got him help, and, you know, he went away. And now that same place, minimum is $30,000. You know what I mean? Which just got a friend of mine some help and sent her up there. But it is really, it's something that wasn't, you know, talked about. You know what I mean? It really wasn't talked about back then.
Now, where do you find a friend who makes his living from a bar that helps to pay for you to go to rehab? You know,
well,
where do you
I'll
find
tell you,
dedication? You
know what? He was a Wildwood Crest guy from day one. His name was Joe Russo, and the bar was Russo's Gingham Club. And it was old school Wildwood guys would hang out there. And they, you know, my dad he was a rough guy, you know, when he got his drink on, it was a rough one most of the time. I was one of those happy drunks, I guess you want to call it. But, you know, when he finally decided it was time, there was a lot of wreckage, you know, and as was with me. There was a lot of wreckage. And, when you talk about a guy who owned the bar and wanted to get you help, you knew you needed help.
Yeah, when the bar owner wants
wants to get you help, you better get some help.
Yeah.
Right? But he was a good friend of my father's and the family. I'm still close with the family of Joe, and talk to them on occasion over the summer. Stay in touch with them on Facebook. But yeah, it's a terrible, terrible disease, but the bottom line is there's help out there. You know what I mean? There's help for people who want it, but you got to want it. You got to want it. Again, you don't have to get off at the bottom of the elevator. You know what I mean? Which, sometimes you may not survive.
And before you got to want it, you got to know you need it.
Oh, no doubt. That's half of it. That's the first half.
That's a big hump right there.
Yeah. No.
And you said use the term rough drunk. That's what I'm used to.
Yeah.
I'm used to breakage, slapping, like a force of nature coming in.
Right.
I'm not used to. I see people now that drink and they get drunk.
Mm-hmm.
And they are these sloppy, emotional dangers to themselves. I'm not used to that kind of drunk.
Well, and that's the thing that when somebody's asking themselves, it's not so much how much you drink, what's happening when you're drinking. If that stuff is happening on a normal basis, you got a problem.
And,
you know what I mean?
And it's odd to me because you see that some people are, irregardless of what the addiction, there's far too many people that have addictions that have people that are enabling them, even if not directly, that aren't saying something. Whether it's that you eat too much and your spouse doesn't call you on it or whatever, there's all kinds of enabling that we do that could help mitigate the problem before it gets out of hand. Correct. Do you speak anywhere about this or?
I do. I don't. The first public thing I did was the video, which is something that Michelle Monzo got me to do, and she got me in touch with Glenn Holston, and at first I was a little reluctant because you're putting yourself out there in front of the world. I mean, and the AA thing is don't break your anonymity or anybody else's. But I felt like I needed to do that. I needed to put myself out there to help people who may be just too afraid to get help on their own, and that they can see that it doesn't matter what you do for a living, you can still ask for help.
Well, you hit an age where you think, how can I best serve? And maybe my anonymity doesn't best serve.
And that's exactly where I was with it. That's exactly where I was with it. I said, you know what? Enough's enough.
Yeah. And Michelle is really great at, I don't want to word this in a bad way or minimizing it, but she's really great at pushing people out into the light, and pushing them in front of crowds to get a good message out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, we talked before about pride and how pride hurts people with this. And pride makes people think that they shouldn't say anything. They should, if you have a problem like this, it's really tough to get through it alone. Mm-hmm. It's sooner or later you got to go to somebody. So why not do it sooner, before it gets...
It's agonizing.
Yeah.
It takes people it took me to the darkest place on this planet, and I would have never believed, if you told me 20 years ago that that's where it was going, I would have just told you, you're crazy, man. You're out of your mind. But it did. It took me to the darkest place on this earth.
How did you manage to keep, you talked about divorce and all the other things. How did you manage to keep your job? The one thing that you kept through the entire thing.
Well, I told them exactly what I was doing, that I was going to get help, and they were all for it. And, I went through a portion of, seeing other professionals, and it got, I got the help I needed, and I didn't know what I was coming back to, but I was welcomed with open arms, by my chief, at the time was Russell Bono. And that really